You asked about the war, and everyone wants to hear about the battles, the big pushes, the names of places you read in the papers. But when I close my eyes, when I really go back, it's never the thunder of the guns I think of first. It's the silence. Not a true silence, mind you, because there was always the wind, or the far-off crump of a shell, or the buzzing in your ears from the noise that had come before. No, I mean the silence inside you, the hollowed-out feeling that was your constant companion. And the only thing that ever filled that silence, even for a minute, was food. Not a grand meal, God no, nothing like that. I'm talking about the taste of home in a tin can, the most important thing in the world when the world has gone mad. Let me tell you, the war wasn't fought with bullets and bombs alone. It was fought with bread and sausage and the desperate hope for a spoonful of jam. The ritual of the ration was everything. It was the anchor of your day, the only moment that had any predictability left in it. You'd hear the word passed down the line, Verpflegung, and it was like a prayer. The clinking of those tins was a sweeter sound than any music. We de-huddled together, my buddies and I, backs against the muddy wall of the trench or crouched behind a shattered stone wall, and we performed the same careful, almost sacred ceremony. Your hands, numb with cold, would fumble with the can opener, the cold metal a familiar sting. You weren't just opening a can. You were opening a tiny, fragile pocket of normalcy. We divide the black bread with a seriousness usually reserved for a state function, eyeing the slices to make sure it was fair, not because we didn't trust each other, but because fairness was one of the last laws of civilization we could still enforce. The sausage, hard as a rock sometimes, would be sliced with a bayonet, each man watching the blade, counting the pieces. There was an entire economy built on survival, a barter system that would put any market to shame. A cigarette, which was like gold, could be traded for an extra spoonful of that awful, watery jam, the kind that was mostly turnip and sugar beet, but it tasted like heaven. You learned the value of everything. A single match was worth a mouthful of someone else's coffee. A dry pair of socks could get you a second hardtack biscuit. It wasn't greed, it was mathematics. It was the calculus of staying alive one more day. And in those moments, with the smell of the food cutting through the stench of mud and cordite and unwashed men, you could almost forget. Almost. That was the magic of it. The ghosts of flavor were powerful things. You take a sip of that ersatz coffee, this bitter brew made from roasted barley and acorns, and you'd close your eyes. If you concentrated hard enough, the taste could transport you. It would pull you out of that frozen foxhole and drop you right back into your mother's kitchen. I could see the checked tablecloth, feel the warmth of the stove, hear the familiar clatter of cups. The phantom sensation of peace was so real it was a physical ache. We all did it. You'd see a man staring into his tin, not moving, just staring, and you knew he wasn't in Russia or France anymore. He was sitting at his own table, with his own family, eating a real meal with real meat and fresh bread. The memories were like a film you could play in your head, and we all had our favorite reels. And if someone, by some miracle, got a package from home with a real piece of chocolate in it, the real stuff, not the waxy imitation we got in the rations, a hush would fall over the whole unit. It was a reverence. The lucky man would never eat it all himself. He'd break it into slivers, tiny shards of sweetness, and pass them around. You put that sliver on your tongue and let it melt, and the shared silence was thicker and more meaningful than any hymn. It was a communion. We were tasting a world that wasn't broken, but that feeling never lasted. The hunger was a constant companion, more present and more honest than fear. Fear came in waves, crashing over you and then receding, leaving you shaking. But the hunger was always there, a gnawing emptiness in your gut that never went away. It was a dull ache that started behind your breastbone and spread outwards, reminding you that you were just an animal in a hole. You learned to eat slowly, to chew each bite of that rock-hard bread until it was a paste, to make the illusion of fullness last a few minutes longer. You'd savor the tiniest morsel. I remember one time, it was during the retreat west, the winter of '44, things were bad. We hadn't had a proper ration in 3 days, just some moldy crackers and melted snow. We were a ragged bunch, more ghosts than men. We stumbled upon an abandoned farmhouse, or what was left of one. The roof was half gone, but the cellar was intact. And inside we found a treasure. A sack of potatoes, some jars of preserved beets, a side of ham hanging from a hook, frozen solid. It was like finding El Dorado. We fell on it like wolves, and I'm not proud of it. We lit a fire in the hearth, risking the smoke giving away our position, and we cooked that ham and those potatoes. The smell was indescribable. We ate until our stomachs hurt, until we were actually full for the first time in months. And then, as we sat there in the flickering light, the guilt set in. This wasn't our food. This was some farmer's winter supply, his family's survival. We had taken it. We were thieves, driven to it by a basic animal need. The warmth in my belly felt like a sin. That's what the war did. It made you ashamed of being full. That's when you understood that sharing your last cracker was the ultimate act of brotherhood. It was a sacrament. If a man offered you his last bite, it meant he valued your life as much as his own. It was a bond stronger than any oath sworn to a flag. And a hot meal, when it miraculously appeared from a field kitchen that had managed to get close to the front, could make grown men weep. I saw it happen. The sight of that steaming cauldron, the smell of real soup, not just warmed-up tins, would break you. You'd stand in line, your mess tin shaking in your hand, and when the cook slopped that ladleful into your tin, the heat would seep through the metal into your frozen fingers. You'd find a spot, sit down, and just look at it for a moment, the steam warming your face. The first spoonful it was like coming back to life. It wasn't just nourishment, it was a message. A message that said somewhere, someone still knew you were alive, that you were a human being who needed warmth and sustenance. It was a reminder of a life where food was a pleasure, not a desperate fuel. And that was the heart of it, you see. Caring about food, savoring a taste, trading for a better bit, feeling guilty for stealing it, that was how we proved we were still human. The army tried to turn us into machines. The war tried to grind us down into nothing, into beasts that only knew how to fight and die. But when we carefully divided a sausage, when we closed our eyes to remember a flavor from home, when we shared our last crumb, we were reclaiming our souls. We were saying, I am still a man. I'm not just a weapon. I feel. I remember, I need. In the end, the war was a lot of things, but for me, it was mostly a long, cold hunger. And the moments that broke that hunger, however briefly, were the moments I survived for. They were the tiny, fragile proofs that there was still something worth surviving for. You never forget the smell, that's what they tell you, and they're right. It wasn't just one smell, see, it was a stew of smells that got inside your clothes, your hair, your skin, so deep I think it's still there sometimes when I get a whiff of something rotten. It was wet wool and mud, the sharp tang of cordite after a shelling, the greasy smell of canned corned beef cooking over a hexamine tablet, and underneath it all always, the sickly sweetness of death. That's what no man's land smelled like. It was a place on the map, sure, but for us, it was more a state of being. A few 100 yards of churned-up earth, rusted wire and broken men, but it had its own rules, not the ones they taught you in basic training. These were the unwritten rules, the ones you learned if you wanted to keep your head down and your soul, what was left of it, intact. It started with the rhythm. War has a rhythm, a brutal, predictable cadence that you learn to dance to if you want to live. The mornings always started the same. Just before first light, when the world was a dull, grey smear, the coffee would be brewing, thick and bitter as tar, and that's when Jerry would send over his morning hate. It was like clockwork. A few shells would whine over, not a full barrage, just enough to let you know they were still there, that they knew you were brewing your coffee. We'd duck down in the funk holes, listening to the crump, crump, crump down the line, and then it would be quiet again. That was harassment fire. You learned the difference between that and the real thing. The real thing, that was a sound you felt in your teeth. The air would just scream, a rising wall of noise that meant the world was ending on your particular patch of mud. But they gave us a list, see, a standard issue list of everything a soldier in the Wehrmacht was supposed to carry. It was all there in black and white, the Mauser rifle, the ammunition pouches, the bread bag, the mess kit, the entrenching tool. They weighed it all out for the quartermasters, I suppose, neat little numbers on a page, but they never weighed the real burden. They never put a number on the fear, or the cold that got into your bones and stayed there, or the sound of a man screaming for his mother over the field telephone. That was the real weight. My particular curse, my extra slice of hell, was the radio. The functurette, a heavy, clunky box of wires and dials that I had to lug on my back everywhere. It was my job, my reason for being there, they said. Radioman. It made my shoulders ache something fierce. A constant, grinding pain that you learn to ignore like you learn to ignore the gnawing hunger in your belly. The strap would cut into my collarbone, and after a day's march through the Russian mud, that feeling was a part of me, as much as my own heartbeat. The rifle, now that was a different kind of weight. It was cold and lethal, and you knew its purpose every time your fingers curled around the stock. It was a dead weight that promised to make other men dead. And the helmet, this steel bowl they stuck on your head, it never felt like protection. Not really. When the shells started coming in, when the shrapnel was whining through the air like angry hornets, that helmet felt like a target, or worse, like a tombstone they'd already fitted for you. It gave you a headache after a while, a dull throb right at your temples, and the chin strap would chafe raw. And that damned gas mask canister, it was always banging against my hip, a clumsy, hollow thud with every step. A constant reminder of a horror we hadn't even faced, a phantom threat of poison gas that was just one more awful possibility in a world full of them. It was like carrying your own coffin around, just in case. But see, that was the official kit, the stuff they knew about, the stuff that kept you a soldier. The things that really kept you alive, the things that kept you from just lying down in the mud and giving up, were the things they didn't know about. The things we smuggled in our pockets next to our hearts. We all had them, a secret stash of memories, a hidden weight that was somehow heavier than all the ammunition in the world, but it was a weight you prayed you'd never have to put down. For me, it was a photograph, not just any photograph. It was of my family, back in my little town near Köln. My mother smiling that worried smile she always had right before I left, my father trying to look stern and proud, and my little sister Lot, her eyes wide like she didn't quite understand what was happening. The paper was worn soft at the edges from me taking it out, usually at night, in the dark, tracing their faces with my grimy thumb by the faint light of a dying fire or a sliver of moon. I didn't need to see it clearly. I had every line, every shadow memorized. The emulsion was starting to smudge from the sweat and the damp. Sometimes, when it was real bad, I put it up to my nose like a fool, hoping to catch some scent of home, of soap and fresh bread, but all I ever smelled was the cheap paper and the stink of cigarettes and dirt on my hands. Then there was the letter, just one, from my Elsa, my fiancée. She'd written me dozens, but this was the first one, the one she slipped into my hand at the station the day I shipped out. I'd read it so many times the creases were white and frayed, and the words were starting to fade. I knew it by heart, every loop of her handwriting, every hopeful, heartbreaking word. My dearest Carl, I will think of you every day. The linden tree in the square is just beginning to bud. Come back to me soon, my love. I'd fold it and refold it along the same lines, a nervous habit, a little ritual that felt like a prayer. It was a piece of her, a whisper from a world that felt a million miles away, a world where things like linden trees budding actually mattered. And in my left pocket, always, a small, smooth stone. I'd picked it up from the riverbank near our house the morning I left. It was grey and flat, worn perfectly smooth by the water. It didn't look like much, but when I get scared, really gut-wrenchingly terrified during a barrage, my fist would clench around it in my pocket. It was cold and solid. Real, a piece of the earth from home, a talisman, a stupid, superstitious thing maybe, but you grab onto anything when you're drowning. Those things were as important as rations, maybe more so. But then there were the other tools, the practical things that were about survival in a different way. Not survival of the body, exactly, but survival of the mind, of the spirit. Old-timers, the few who'd been in the thick of it since 39, they'd give you advice. And the best advice I ever got was from a grizzled sergeant from Hamburg who smelled of schnapps and wood smoke. Boy, he'd grunted at me one evening, you take care of your feet, and your feet will take care of you. Everything else is secondary. He wasn't wrong. In the freezing mud of the arse front, a pair of dry, clean pair of socks was more valuable than gold, more valuable than a general's medal. I always carried an extra pair, wrapped in an oilcloth to keep them dry. The feeling of taking off your wet, filthy boots, caked in mud that was half ice, and peeling away the sodden socks that felt like dead skin, and then putting on those clean, dry wool socks, it was a small slice of heaven. It was a feeling of being human again, if only for a few minutes. It was a victory. Then there was my diary, just a small, cheap notebook I'd scrounged. I kept it hidden in the bottom of my pack, wrapped in a spare shirt. I didn't write about tactics or movements. That would have got me shot for espionage if I'd been caught. No, I wrote about the fear. The things I could never say out loud to the other men. I wrote about how my hands shook so bad after a close call with a mortar round that I couldn't light a cigarette. I wrote about the dream I kept having of Elsa, where she'd be walking away from me and I couldn't call out to her. I wrote down the names of the boys in my unit who didn't make it, just their first names and the date. France, 14 October, Erich, 3 November. It was a confessional, a place to put the poison inside me so it wouldn't fester. And then there was my knife. Not the bayonet, that was for the enemy, a brutal, ugly thing. This was a small, makeshift knife I'd traded a pack of cigarettes for. I used it to open cans of corned beef, to whittle a piece of wood into a crude chess piece during the long, boring stretches, to cut a piece of string. It was a tool for life, for small tasks. Using it felt normal, civilized. It was a tiny reminder that there was a world where knives were for whittling and opening food, not for killing. But these things, these precious, hidden things, they became a burden too, a burden of sentiment. When the order came to move out, and your pack felt like it was filled with lead, and your legs were jelly, you faced a choice. A terrible, heartbreaking choice. What do you leave behind? The army stuff you couldn't ditch. They'd court-martial you. But the personal things, they were dead weight. I saw men, tough men who'd faced down Russian tanks without flinching, break down crying when they had to choose which memory to abandon by the side of the road. I remember once, during a brutal retreat in the snow, we'd been marching for 2 days with hardly any rest. My pack straps were cutting into my shoulders so deep I had bloody sores. Every step was agony. I had to lighten the load. The rations were gone. The extra ammunition was gone. It came down to my spare socks and my diary. The socks were survival. The diary was my sanity. I stood there, stumbling in the snow, tears freezing on my cheeks, holding one in each hand. In the end, survival won. I left the diary under a rock, a little white lump in the vast whiteness. I felt like I'd left a part of my soul there, a piece of my mind. It was a different kind of death, and losing a personal item by accident was a special kind of agony. I remember a guy in my unit, Wilhelm, a big, quiet farmer's son from Bavaria. He carried a lock of his baby girl's hair, blonde as wheat, in a tiny silver locket. One day, during a frantic scramble to dig a new foxhole under artillery fire, the chain must have snapped. He didn't realize it was gone until later. When he did, he went berserk. He tore apart his pack, his uniform, crawled around in the mud of the trench, his hands bleeding, screaming her name, Greta, Greta. It was a raw, animal sound. We all helped him look, sifting through the muck with our bare hands, but it was gone. Just gone. He wasn't the same after that. It was like the light inside him had gone out. He became quiet, hollow. He was killed a week later near Kharkiv. I sometimes wonder if he'd just given up. Those small objects, they were anchors. They held us to who we were, to the men we used to be. Without them, you risked turning into just a machine, a thing that followed orders, that killed, that felt nothing. The army wanted machines. But we fought like hell, in our own small ways, to stay human. It was the little things that made the big difference. The taste of a rotten potato you managed to roast over a smuggled fire, the best meal you'd ever eaten. The smell of cheap tobacco in a damp cigarette, shared between 2 men who didn't need to speak. The sound of silence after days of constant shelling, a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure on your ears. The feel of a warm spot on a frozen log where the sun had hit it for just a few minutes. And the radio, always the radio, my burden. It hissed and crackled with the voices of ghosts. I heard orders, confused and frantic, from commanders miles away who had no idea what the mud and the blood looked like up close. I heard the panicked calls for support from other units, their voices tight with a fear I knew all too well. And sometimes, worst of all, I heard the end of things. A transmission would cut out mid-sentence, replaced by a loud, screeching static. Or you'd hear the screams before it went dead. You'd be sitting there in your hole in the ground with the headphones on, and you'd be connected to another man's final moment. You heard his last breath, his last curse, his last prayer. And then nothing. Just the empty hiss of the ether, and you were left alone, carrying the weight of that silence. You see, they never told you that. They never put on the list that you'd have to carry the sound of other men dying in your ears. That was the heaviest thing of all. So we clung to our photographs, our letters, our stupid little stones. We clung to the memory of a world where silence was just silence, and a weight on your back was just a sack of potatoes. We carried it all, the steel and the sorrow, the official and the secret, hoping that one day, if we were lucky, we'd get to put it all down for good. The first thing that comes back isn't sound, it's this god-awful ringing, a high-pitched whine that gets inside your skull and just lays eggs there. It's like someone shoved a church bell in each ear and then clapped them together. For a long while, that's all there is. The world has gone mute, switched off by the concussions. You're in a bubble, a silent film where you're the only character, and everything you just lived through the whistle screams coming down, the ground heaving like a live animal trying to throw you off. The flashes that lit up the inside of your eyelids, it all feels like a memory from a week ago, not 60 seconds. You have to piece reality back together, and you start with your own body. You pat yourself down, your hands moving on their own, checking for the warm, sticky wetness that means you're hit. Your fingers fumble over your wool tunic, your trousers, your face. They come away dry. It's a shock every time, a little jolt of disbelief. I'm still here. I'm still in one piece. The guy next to you, Klaus, his mouth is moving. You see his lips shaping words, his face contorted, but all you get is that damned ringing. You just nod, a stupid, meaningless gesture, because what else can you do? Your head feels stuffed with cotton wool and bees. Slowly, like a radio being tuned from a long way off, other sounds start to bleed through the whine. It's not the world coming back, not really. It's the new world, the one the shelling just built. You risk a look over the lip of the foxhole, and it's like you've landed on the moon. Nothing is where it's supposed to be. The familiar profile of the woods line is just a collection of splintered toothpicks. The cart track we used to bring up supplies is a cratered mess. The air is thick with a choking haze, a fog of powdered earth and something else, something sharp and acrid that catches in the back of your throat cordite. That smell, that's the smell of death. It gets into your clothes, your hair, your lungs. It's a smell you'll wake up to in your bed 20 years from now, I swear. You start scanning, your eyes darting from hole to hole, looking for movement, for a wave, for any sign of the guys you were just joking with an hour ago. You dread the stillness. You see a helmet and your heart leaps, but then you see it's just sitting there, upright on a pile of dirt, and there's nothing underneath it. Your stomach turns to ice. You count the positions silently, ticking them off in your head. Mueller and his MG-42 team were over by the haystack. The haystack is gone. A deep, cold pit opens up in your gut. Then you hear it, cutting through the fading ring in your ears. Not a scream, not a curse. A whimper, a low, broken sound like a child S. Mutter bit muddy, over and over. It's young Hans, the kid from Hamburg who just turned 18 last month and still had a pimple on his chin. He's crying for his mother. That sound, that's the sound that haunts me. More than the explosions, more than the officers shouting, it's that simple, terrified plea for comfort that'll follow me to my grave. We scrambled out of our hole, our bodies moving stiffly like old men. We found him half-buried in the dirt, his leg bent all wrong. He just kept crying for his mother, his face streaked with mud and tears. You try to say something, anything, but the words just die in your throat. What can you say? Then someone else shouted, "Over here. They're buried." And we turned to see a foxhole that had taken a direct hit. It wasn't a hole anymore, it was just a depression, collapsed in on itself. We fell on it with our entrenching tools, with our bare hands, digging like madmen. The dirt was loose and heavy. You'd scoop away a shovelful and more would slide back in. You're digging, and you're praying you hear a cough, a groan, any sign of life. But there was nothing, just the sound of our own panting and the soft shuffle of dirt. We dug until we found Beck's hand, just his hand, sticking out of the earth, clutching nothing. We stopped then. There was no point anymore. You just look at that hand, and you know the rest of him is gone. The silence from that position, the one we were all dreading, it was absolute. It was a heavier weight than any shell. It meant Beck and Jansen were finished, just like that. The silence after a barrage wasn't peaceful. It was full of ghosts. After the digging, after checking the wounded, that's when the real quiet would set in. The kind of quiet that's louder than the battle. Your hands won't stop shaking. It's not fear, not exactly. It's the leftover vibration from the world ending around you. You fumble for your cigarette case, your fingers so numb and clumsy you can barely get one out. You light it, the match flame dancing wildly because your hand is trembling so much. That first drag, pulling the smoke deep into your lungs, is the only thing that feels real. You look around at the other guys. Nobody speaks. What is there to say? You just sit there, smoking, your eyes meeting theirs for a second, and you see the same hollowed-out look. You see the relief because you're still breathing, and you see the guilt because Beck and Jansen aren't, and you see the dread because you know this is just a lull. The officers are on the field telephone, their voices low and urgent. You know what that means. They're regrouping. The Russians are regrouping too. The silence is just a pause, a chance to catch your breath before the next round. And the waiting, God, the waiting is its own special kind of torture. Your mind starts running, thinking about home, about your mother's cooking, about a girl you danced with once, any damn thing to get away from this field of mud and death. You try to make a joke, something dark, something only a soldier would understand. Well, that was a hell of a wake-up call, you might mutter, and someone will give a dry, humorless laugh, more of a cough, really. It's not funny, but you have to laugh, or you'll start screaming and never stop. I remember one time, after a particularly bad one, we were so keyed up we couldn't even sit still. My buddy France, he had this little harmonica he always carried. It was dented and rusty, but it worked. He pulled it out, his hands still shaking, and he started to play this old folk song, something from home, a drinking song, really. The notes came out thin and wavering in the quiet air. For a minute it was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. It was a piece of our old life, a little sliver of normalcy. Then a sniper's bullet cracked past, whistling overhead, and France stopped dead. The music died instantly. We all ducked, the spell broken. That was the reality. There was no escape, not even for the length of a song. The silence was a lie. It was just the battlefield holding its breath. You try to eat something, maybe a piece of hardtack, but it tastes like sawdust and cordite, and your mouth is so dry you can hardly swallow. You sip a little water from your canteen, but it's warm and tastes of metal. Everything tastes of metal, did you know that? Fear has a taste. It's coppery, like biting your own lip. You think about the weirdest things in those moments. I'd think about my father's pocket watch, the way it ticked so steadily on the mantelpiece. I'd think about the smell of rain on hot pavement back in my hometown. I'd give anything to hear that ticking, to smell that rain, instead of this deafening silence and the stink of high explosives. You look at the guy next to you, and you know he's thinking the same thing about his own home, his own life before this nightmare. You develop a kinship that's thicker than blood, because these men are the only thing standing between you and the abyss. You learn everything about them. You know that Muller snores like a chainsaw. You know that Carl always had a picture of his dog, not his girlfriend, tucked into his helmet liner. You know that France, the one with the harmonica, cried in his sleep some nights, calling out for his younger brother. We were just kids, most of us. Kids who should have been worrying about football matches and first dates, not which shell has your name on it. The dark humor was our armor. We had a name for our radio set, a bulky, heavy thing I had to lug around everywhere. We called her Gretchen. "How's Gretchen today, Erich? Is she in a good mood?" someone would ask. And if the static was bad, I'd say, Gretchen's got a headache, leave her alone. It sounds stupid now, but it helped. It made the machinery of war feel a little less monstrous, gave it a personality. But then the orders would crackle through Gretchen's speaker, a distorted, metallic voice telling us to stand ready, that enemy infantry was massing, and the joke would die in your throat. Gretchen was just a messenger, and her messages were usually bad news. The worst was the night. The silence at night was a living thing. Every little noise was amplified 1,000 times. A pebble shifting, the wind rustling a piece of canvas, it could sound like an entire platoon moving in on you. You'd be on watch, staring into the inky blackness until you started seeing things, shapes moving where there was nothing. Your imagination becomes your worst enemy. You'd hear the Russians talking, their voices carrying across no man's land, and they didn't sound like monsters. They sounded tired, just like us. Sometimes one of them would start singing, a sad, lonely sound that made you homesick for a place you'd never been. You start to wonder about the guy on the other side of the wire. Does he have a girl back home? Is he as scared as you are? Does he just want to go home too? But then the morning would come, and the shelling would start again, and he was just a target, and you were just a target, and the temporary humanity of the night would vanish in the smoke. It does something to you, that cycle. The violence, then the silence, then the waiting, then more violence. It grinds you down. It hollows you out. You become a shell of the person you were, just going through the motions, your emotions numb because feeling anything too deeply, the grief for your friends, the terror of the next attack, would be too much to bear. You learn to function in that silence. You learn to hear the difference between the silence of an empty field and the silence of the enemy creeping up on you. Your ears become your best weapon. You'd listen to the crickets. If the crickets stopped chirping, that was a bad sign. It meant something or someone was out there disturbing them. So you'd sit in the dark, straining to hear those insects, praying for them to keep singing their mindless song, because their song meant you were safe, for a few more minutes at least. I think about the men we lost not as heroes in some grand painting, but as boys I shared a cigarette with. I remember Beck's laugh, a big, booming thing that didn't seem to fit his skinny frame. I remember how he always managed to find a few potatoes to fry up, a little luxury in the middle of hell. And now he's just a hand sticking out of the dirt. That's what the silence after the shelling leaves you with. Not peace, not relief. Just the stark, simple, terrifying memory of a hand and the echoing silence where a laugh used to be. You survive, you go on, you try to build a life after the war, but you carry that silence with you. It's always there, just beneath the surface of everyday sounds, the traffic, the conversations, the music. It's a void that never gets filled. And sometimes, on a quiet afternoon, when everything is still, I can still hear it. Not the ringing that eventually went away, but the other silence. The heavy, waiting silence. The one that comes after the last shell falls and before the next one hits. And I can still smell the cordite. You want to know about the war, not the dates and the battles you can read in a book, but the real thing, the thing that stays with you in the quiet moments 50 years later. I'll tell you, but I won't tell you about the medals or the glory. I'll tell you about the letters, the ones I wrote and the ones I didn't. You see, every soldier had two wars to fight. One was out there, in the mud and the smoke. The other was right here, on a crumpled piece of paper, with a stub of a pencil in my shaking hand. I'd start with the easy one, the one for home. Dearest Muddy, liebe Elsa, I'd write, my breath fogging in the icy air of the dugout. The candle flickered, throwing crazy shadows on the log walls, making the faces of my buddies look like skulls. I'd tell them the food was fine, that we'd had a hot stew just last night. The truth was the stew was thin as dishwater, with a few gristly chunks of something we called old horse, and we were lucky to get it. I'd say the weather was cold but bearable, that we had plenty of warm blankets. The truth was the cold was a living thing, a thief that stole right into your bones, and the damp wool of my uniform never really dried. It just got a little less wet sometimes. I could feel the lice crawling on my skin as I wrote those cheery lies. I'd promise a swift return. I'll be home by Christmas, I'm sure of it. I'd scribble, one Christmas after another, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. That was the worst lie of all, a promise made to them that was really a desperate prayer I was making to myself. I could hear the artillery rumbling in the distance, a constant thunder that was the real answer to my promise. I'd sign it, your loving son, your faithful Carl, and I'd feel like a fraud. That letter was a kind of shield, you see, something to protect them from the reality of this rotten, stinking war. But a shield works both ways. It also kept me from them, because the man writing those bland, hopeful words wasn't me anymore. The real me was screaming underneath. So then, when that letter was done, I'd take out another piece of paper, a page I kept tucked inside my helmet liner next to the little photo of Elsa. This was the real letter, the one I wrote for me. This was where the screaming got a voice. I'd start by confessing the fear. It wasn't the sharp, sudden fear of a shell landing close that makes you jump and your heart hammer. No, this was a low, constant hum, a vibration in your soul that never, ever stopped. It was there when I tried to sleep, twisting my dreams into nightmares of endless trenches and faceless enemies. It was there when I ate, making the meager food sit in my stomach like a stone. It was a companion more constant than any of my kameraden. I was terrified of dying, sure, who was? But I was also terrified of living, of seeing the next horrible thing, of having to do the next terrible thing. I had to write it down, get it out, or I thought my skull would split open from the pressure. And then I'd write about the boy. Not the enemy, the soldier, the target. The boy. It was outside a burned-out village, a place whose name I've tried to forget. We were clearing houses, a nasty, close-quarters business. I rounded a corner into a garden, and there he was, a Russian kid, couldn't have been more than 18, fumbling with the bolt on his rifle. His eyes were wide with the same fear I felt. We were so close I could see the peach fuzz on his chin. There was no time to think, only to act. My rifle came up and the shot echoed, louder than any thunder. It was him or me, that's what they tell you, and I guess it's true because I'm here and he's not. But when I walked over, he was still alive, gasping, his hand clutching his stomach. He looked at me, and he wasn't a soldier anymore. He was just a scared kid, a long way from home, dying in the dirt. He said something in Russian, his voice a wet whisper. It might have been Mama. I think it was Mama. I can still see his face, Elsa. Not in my dreams, but when I'm awake, when I'm shaving, when I'm looking out at the garden. It's just there. I put that in the letter, the whole ugly truth. I wrote down the treason, too. The thoughts that would have gotten me branded a coward or worse. I'd ask the paper, what are we even doing here? What is this for? For the fatherland, this mud, this death, this misery. I saw a political officer give a speech once, talking about glory and destiny, and all I could think about was the smell of gangrene in the field hospital and the sound of the medics sobbing when they couldn't save one of us. This wasn't glory. This was a meat grinder, and we were the meat. Those hidden pages were full of questions I knew had no answers. Why was I, Carl Becker, a radio operator from a quiet little town on the Rhine, lying in a frozen ditch in the middle of Russia? The reason they gave us, the big patriotic idea, felt as distant and cold as the stars above. It didn't keep you warm at night. It didn't fill your belly. It didn't explain why my friend Klaus, who could make anyone laugh even in the worst shelling, was now just a pale, stiff body wrapped in a ground sheet. I'd wonder if Elsa, the girl I left behind, would even know me if I walked through the door tomorrow. The boy who kissed her goodbye at the station was gone. This new man had hands that were permanently stained with dirt and something else, something darker that wouldn't scrub off. He jumped at the sound of a car backfiring. He saw threats in every shadow. He knew how easy it was to kill a man. What would she see when she looked into my eyes? Would she see the boy she loved, or would she see the ghost I'd become? And God, where was God in all this? We'd pray, sure, when the shells were falling. God, get me through this and I'll be a better man. But after a while, the prayers felt like you were shouting into a void. The churches were rubble, the chaplains looked as haunted as the rest of us, and the only thing that fell from heaven was shrapnel and rain. I wrote that down too. I asked the paper if God had abandoned this God-forsaken place, or if he had ever been here at all. It was a frightening thing to write, but on that page it felt true. Then came the hardest part, the final draft. I'd read over my true letter, the one with my soul spilled out on it. The ink would be smudged from my damp fingers or maybe from something else. And then I'd tear it. Just a small rip at first, then another and another, until the page was a handful of confetti. I'd crawl out of the dugout into the trench, and I'd open my hand to the wind. Those pieces, those secrets, those screams, they'd scatter into the night, drifting down into the mud, getting trampled by the next patrol, washed away by the next rain. It felt like a confession, not to a priest, but to the earth itself, the only thing that seemed to understand, because it had swallowed so much blood and so many secrets already. It was a funeral for the truth. And after that act of destruction, I felt a loneliness so profound it was like a physical pain. I was utterly alone with the things I had seen and done. I'd go back inside, my hands empty, and I'd take out the first letter, the lie. I'd seal the envelope, the sound of the flap sticking down sounding like the closing of a tomb. That letter was safe. It was harmless. It would bring comfort to my mother, hope to my sweetheart. But sending it felt like I was sending a part of myself away, the last good part, and I was left here, in the freezing dark, with only the ghost of the boy I killed and the echo of my own cowardice for company. That's how you really fought the war. Not just with a rifle, but with a pencil. And you always, always had to make sure the wrong words never got sent home.